It's all about having the key insights, following the leaders of the crypto industry and background stories on blockchain technology trends to keep you one step ahead. Monty Metzger, CEO of LCX.com, keeps you up to speed with what's moving global crypto markets and gives you the latest insights about LCX's platform and ecosystem. This is LCX Insights Live.
Excellent. Welcome everybody here to this LCX Insights Live. In this live video shows, I'm engaging with the world's top blockchain projects, entrepreneurs, investors, and pioneers in crypto and blockchain in honest conversations meant to challenge traditional ways of thinking. My name is Monty Metzger, and I'm founder and CEO of LCX.com. LCX is a regulated fintech company that focuses on digital asset trading, compliant token offerings, and tokenization. LCX received 8 blockchain-related approvals by the Liechtenstein regulator. That's more than any other company in the country, which we're proud of. And Liechtenstein is a country next to Switzerland and Austria in the middle of Europe. It has received a AAA rating as a country by Standard & Poor's. That's the highest rating possible, so very high reputation. But beyond that, Liechtenstein has introduced the most forward-thinking legal framework for cryptocurrencies and blockchain companies, providing legal clarity for any token sale and, of course, security for all LCX users. But today's show is all about the Metaverse. It's about Klaytn and the access path to the Metaverse. And we have a very special guest today. He is head of global adoption at Klaytn Foundation. Please welcome David Shin. Where are you? Welcome.
Hello there. Hi. Thanks for having me.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, and thrilled to have you on the show. I think there's so much where the community wants to learn about your growth path, the roadmap ahead, but also kind of a status quo of where you stand. So can you give a brief introduction about the Klaytn Foundation and also your role over there?
Yeah, sure. So Klaytn is the blockchain division or the blockchain arm of a Korean Web2 juggernaut called Kakao Group. Kakao was founded in 2010. They started out as a chat application. They were actually one of the first in Asia. And they ended up really turning the chat application into a super app. Mm-hmm. One might kind of think about applications like WeChat in Asia when you think about large super apps. The one interesting story is that Tencent is one of our largest early investors. Mm-hmm. And in fact, part of the deal was to have Kakao Group at the time help them develop WeChat. Mm-hmm. And so there's a strong bond and relationship between Tencent and WeChat and Kakao and kakaotalk, which is their version of WeChat. So in 2019, Kakao decided to go live on mainnet with their version of a blockchain, which is an Ethereum fork called Klaytn. Mm-hmm. It's, I would say, actually, as of the end of March, it's EVM. It's beyond EVM compatible. It's actually Ethereum equivalent. So we've gone the direction of essentially taking the latest upgrade of Ethereum and really working off the basis of that in terms of our mainnet. We have subtle differences in that. I wouldn't say subtle. We have differences in that we've modified the consensus algorithm. We're not a proof of work, obviously. We're a proof of stake, and we have a governance council network that is built to validate our transactions. In terms of the governance council members, we have members such as LG, which is a large manufacturer. Some of the people who are watching or listening, they may know LG from the TVs that they watch or some of the handphones or laptops and computers that they use. We also have Gumi, which is a large Japanese gaming company. We have WorldPay, which is a large US-based payment processor. We even have Binance Global as one of our governance council members. And so there's several of them. There's probably about 35 at the moment. and we're looking to grow that upwards of 50, and really trying to expand our international contributions in the governance council space. So that's Klaytn in a nutshell. We are effectively looking to really expand in the GameFi space, as well as looking at metaverses and looking at opportunities to integrate our blockchain into various different metaverses, as well as our focus is really around the creator economy.
Okay, let's break it down. I think a lot of things you mentioned are interesting for the community to understand. So maybe let's start with where you come from as an organization. Are you in Seoul right now also?
I'm actually based in Singapore.
In Singapore, okay.
Yeah, so Kakao obviously is at our head office is in Korea.
Yeah. So let's speak about this a little bit, because it's important to understand. For me, South Korea is like the innovation hotspot of a lot of things. You had been always ahead of like the metaverse, cyberworld had been there around since a very long time. And it for me, it feels like a Galapagos Island often, because there are so many species which are in South Korea, but nowhere else, like Naver being a market leader in search, KakaoTalk. What makes Seoul and South Korea so unique in terms of this digital ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's the propensity of the average person to adopt technology fairly quickly, to embrace efficiency in their day-to-day. It really started with the fact that Korea is a very retail and institutional driven trading market. So people are watching the stock markets constantly. And through that, innovation really came into play as particularly the retail market started to get more involved in the stock market. And they were demanding more direct integration through their brokers into the stock market or to the exchange. And therefore, there's been a lot of innovation around direct market access, or DMA as we call it. And so that's kind of where a lot of the, what I would say from a financial perspective, that's where a lot of this technology adoption really started happening, was at the retail investment level. Corporations obviously have always invested in that space, but it was retail in Korea that's quite big actually, who really was demanding the evolution of retail applications to be made. And so when crypto came along, quite frankly, it was a very natural sort of transition for the retail and corporate adoption market for crypto. They're quite keen and already pretty self-sufficient in trading directly to stock market. So it was quite an easy transition.
Yeah. But give us some numbers. How big is KakaoTalk at the moment?
Well, that's a very good question. Over 95% of the population in Korea is on KakaoTalk. So
95.
It is, yeah, over 95. So it pretty much is the predominant chat application. There's no other one in Korea. But what's more important to this is the fact that there are residual, or not residual, but there's additional, I would say, functions that really add to the value of the chat function. So it's not just chatting. You've got everything from Kakao Pay to being able to do online banking, to essentially being able to shop, being able to invest. So there's a lot of these residual rollover functionalities that really embed into KakaoTalk, creating the super app environment, which is very similar to what WeChat does in China.
Exactly, but that's important to understand, because you have a very strong ecosystem. So it's like in the West, everybody knows Telegram. So when they wanted to launch their own blockchain and token, I think Klaytn is as big and bigger because you started it and made it a big success. But now, like when you look at from the launch there with Klaytn Foundation, when was it founded, and how did you get started with it? So it's a fork, you said, or built on Ethereum, meant to like be the alternative.
Right.
When was that moment, and how did you get started with it?
Sure. So Klaytn went live on mainnet in 2019, but prior to that, 2 years prior in 2017, the Kakao Group formed a subsidiary called GroundX.
Mm-hmm.
And GroundX was sort of the R&D entity that was tasked to create a blockchain. And
Mm-hmm.
so the decision was made to fork Ethereum with modifications, as I mentioned earlier. So from 2017 to 2019, it was just really lab work, essentially doing all the engineering that was required to get the Ethereum fork into a state that we thought would be good enough to release into mainnet. So that's what happened in a very sort of high level view of 2017 to 2019. 2019, it rolls out into mainnet. Really, the adoption was primarily focused in on the Korea market.
Mm-hmm.
This is both adoption from the developer standpoint as well as, well, I guess, development, user, and investor standpoint. Most of that, all three channels really were focused in on Korea. Fast forward to 2021, around this time, one of the co-founders of Kakao, the vice chairman, asked me to join because the 2-year period from 2019 to 2021, again, adoption was concentrated and very hyper-local to Korea, and they wanted to take Klaytn more global. So I was brought in to do that. And so my official title, just to rewind back to your question about 5 minutes ago, my official title here is the head of global adoption for the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really to focus in on developer adoption, user, and investor adoption.
Okay. That's an important part, because I do see these like barriers from a lot of innovation coming out of South Korea, who are like locked within language barriers or ecosystem. You know, we don't have such a infrastructure everywhere. But I've been there too, so like many times, and I just try to find some of the pictures. We also visited KakaoTalk back, I think 2008, and in 2014 again, and also like Naver and some of the players. And I still have your yellow mascot, the little KakaoTalk mascot back at home. So, and what's very interesting here is I think you have a different approach than a lot of blockchain projects, giving the big user base you have in South Korea, but also the tech experience. So now tell us, how is Klaytn chain different from multiple other like layer 1 blockchains out there?
So technically, to the developer, we don't want to be very different than other EVM compatible chains.
Mm-hmm.
We actually want to be very similar. We want to try and smooth out the what I call the brain damage curve for developers. I saw a lot of that when I was at Tezos prior to being here.
Mm-hmm.
And so really the idea is to focus in on building as much developer toolkits and SDKs and APIs so that it's very seamless for them. But more importantly, that we're following the guidelines of where developers are building the most, which is Ethereum. And so we take in things like Solidity, Yule, and Viper into our environments for coding programming languages in terms of the smart contract. So that we want to be similar there. In terms of the actual different... Yeah, sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, I read about Klaytn 1.0 and 2.0. Can you explain what are the differences there, and how did it evolve?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're different on the user side. I think that's important to highlight. So similar on the developer side. On the user side, really, it's about how we look at different use cases compared to other layer 1s that are EVM compatible. Mm-hmm. So for us, we have been always focused in on, since last year, Q3, the development of our ecosystem for the Metaverse use case, the GameFi use case, as well as the creator economy use case. And so really, we've been taking our resources and looking at areas within those 3 sectors to try and build and find more projects to build on Klaytn. In terms of 1.0 to 2.0, very good question. 1.0 is just a reflection of what we were as an organization, as a platform, as a blockchain from say 2019 to 2021, when the initial adoption was really focusing on Korea, and a lot of the building was around DeFi as a use case. KLATYN 2.0 really represents our global ambition since I arrived, and looking at where we go from 1.0 to 2.0 with respect to evolving from DeFi as our ecosystem and moving into GameFi, Metaverse, and the creator economy.
Great. So we talked about the differences and also the key elements of growth there. But now we want to speak about the Metaverse. What is the Metaverse according to you?
Yeah, great question. So the way we look at the Metaverse, we look at it as a persistent, a virtual persistent environment running 24/7, 365 days a week. Sorry, 365 days a year. But the important differentiation is we feel that if there are no tokenomics that are integrated into a metaverse, it really is just a video game. And so integrating the blockchain into a metaverse is highly crucial and important in terms of the growth of the valuation of the overall blockchain universe, in our opinion. In addition to that, we think that creating economic activity within these persistent environments will help us scale the use case of the metaverse. Because if you take away everything I just said, at the end of the day, it just becomes a video game or a two-dimensional experience. So really, if I were to narrow it down, it's really about that economic experience, that economic activity between those who are interactively involved in a metaverse. And that economic activity being fueled by some sort of tokenomics, whether it's through an NFT as an asset or whether it's through some sort of settlement asset. It can be a barter between two different players that are in the metaverse, between a game, someone who's holding a skin in a game versus someone who is holding a different weapon. But the interoperability and the portability through the blockchain is what really is the underlying highlighting point that we see here.
And in terms of the highlighting point, how does it, does it refer to any experience from South Korea's experience around cyberworld also? Are there some learnings taking from the old cyber world into the metaverse?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's a little bit of that. There's a lot of, the gaming, because as you probably know, Korea is a big gaming market as well. So there's a lot of the gaming learnings there as well, because what we've learned and what we've observed is that virtual environments, whether it's a game or whether it's cyberworld or what have you, where people are all on a server and they're interacting, is limited in the current Web 2, Web 1 environment. It's limited because you can create liquidity coming in through a credit card or through some other sort of PayPal transaction, as an example, but you cannot have off-platform liquidity. You can't take that liquidity out. And I think that inability to have portability, if you will, between creating value within that virtual platform, whether it's a game or whether it's cyberworld or whatever it is, and not being able to take that back out and port that somewhere else. I think this is where the problem lies, and this is where blockchain. And so really we're taking that and we're looking at the opportunities around that.
But the question arises, why is everyone building their own metaverse? And how would you answer that? And why are you following that path, or why are you better than others?
Yeah, for us, our Web 2 DNA, we always go back to sort of what we're good at. We are the king of Web 2 in Korea. There's really no one that does it better. In fact, Korea as a country, if you look at from a Web 2 standpoint, so Naver and Line, which is the other major chat application in Asia, particularly in Japan, Thailand, and Taiwan, that's a Korean company who created that. Kakao was created by a Korean company. WeChat was a copy of Kakao. So when you think about it in that regard, we're talking about Korea as a country being very good at Web 2. Okay. Also, just Northeast Asia as a region or a sub-region, very strong in gaming. And a lot of people have grown up sort of playing games or being involved in some sort of virtual persistent environment. And so with that, there's a lot of things that I think we take into our traditional DNA, and we roll that into the Web3 environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it would be very difficult when you're talking about GameFi or the metaverse or even creator economies, because we're talking about NFTs, we're talking about creating economic value through innovation around art or music or what have you. Korea is a very strong market for that kind of content IP as well. And so there's a lot of good things happening in the traditional side that we're bringing into the Web3 side, which is how we differentiate ourselves from some of the other players that are out there.
And when we talk about differentiation, I read a lot about a regulatory setup also in South Korea. What's your take on that, or your take on that, and how does it come into play at Klaytn?
Yeah, so at Klaytn, we are. It was announced, last year that the Central Bank of Korea decided to use Klaytn to be the platform to start piloting their CBDC project on. So that's on one side. The other side is we very much look at regulated assets, okay, and really try and stay away from anything that is not regulated.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a strong DNA to really go down that path. And if you ask me why, it's simply because cacao is a large part of the GDP of Korea. We are, as a Web2 company, Kakao Group, we work very closely with the government. And so everything we do on the Web3 side, we want to make sure that we are consistent, but also more importantly, that we're engaging the regulator before we jump into anything. So at the end of the day, it's very important for us to do the things that we do, including the metaverse, while we have one leg in with the regulator and making sure that things are done the right way.
Mm-hmm. That very much goes aligned with our vision at LCX, as we gained all these regulatory approvals, spent a lot of time and effort and money into that setup. And I think that's interesting to see that now the CBDC Korea is being tested on Klaytn. What's the status on that? Is that in pilot project mode, or can you tell us more about the CBDC project?
Yeah, sadly, I can't go into too much detail. I'm sure your audience can appreciate, but we are actively continuing to progress the agenda in terms of doing the testing, setting things up in terms of the POC. So yes, that is ultimately at a high level progressing forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and but overall, taking a step back, what problem are you trying to solve primarily
with the CBDC project?
With Klaytn as a blockchain as a whole, let's say.
I think we're really not specifically trying to target detailed problems. I think what we're trying to do is achieve more open source and decentralization across business models. I think the average person, the average business, probably when they assess and analyze their financials, whether you're a personal investor or a corporate investor, what you'll realize is there's a lot of money being taken in the middle. And so the question really becomes, can we run models where we don't have to trust a third party or an intermediary, whether it's a bank or whether it's some other sort of agency that sits in between and brokers a transaction? Can we do that by having validation through smart contracts? And if so, how much of that can that be permissionless and open source? So that's really the goal that we're trying to achieve. And we're trying to do it in a way where we think that, regulated governance is important in all the business models that we are trying to disrupt. I think at the end of the day, what we don't want to do is cause disruption for the sake of creating chaos, but creating technological disruption for the interest of efficiency between two parties.
Let's take a question from the community. I just been speaking about regulation. Also, there's one from Tim Khan. Is Klaytn regulated with licenses?
We're not. So we're a nonprofit foundation based out of Singapore. Obviously, Kakao is a large conglomerate based in Korea. They have traditional businesses in gaming, entertainment, communications, etc. Klaytn itself is not regulated. We're not in the business of doing any sort of trading or facilitating trading. We're not in the business of banking. We are in the business of open source blockchain technology in terms of trying to create adoption around bringing developers to build on our platform, as well as bringing in investors who want to invest in growing our ecosystem. But more importantly, to try and create better opportunities for users to be on Web3 in a more seamless way. So that's a long way of saying we are not in a regulated business, Tim, and thank you for your question. We are in a business of more of a nonprofit open source technology organization.
Mm-hmm. You also asked, like, as we spoke about Web 2.0, and you mentioned South Korea had been a key successor for that on Web 2.0. So do you think Korea will continue the success with Web 3.0?
I think Korea is the key market. Look, I mean, there are many markets here. So, let me just differentiate by saying in Asia, I think Korea is absolutely the hot market to be in right now for Web3. And it's as simple as this. China is closed for business. They're very public about that. I think even with the lockdowns, it's just physically difficult for China to be agile enough to really move the needle forward in Web3. Korea has always been number 2 in terms of liquidity, but also in terms of technological advancement. China and Korea have really been leading the way in Web 2. And so when you think of it that way, now that China is closed for business, Korea really becomes the it market in Asia.
The it market in Asia. And when I look at your roadmap, which is public on your website at klaytn.foundation, there are many exciting things. Can you summarize what's up on your roadmap? What are the most important things?
Yeah, on our roadmap, in the short term, in the near term, I think some of the more important things is continuing on the engineering side to build scalability into our infrastructure. So currently, we're at about 4,000 TPS. We want to scale that up to 10,000 before the end of the year, and that's on the roadmap. There are other areas around integrating different third-party services, whether it's Chainlink or some indexing services, or whether it's the bridges that we want to build through our Wormhole partnership. All those things are happening, and that would be what I would call your near-term priorities. In terms of mid to longer term priorities, I think it's really about trying to make sure that we are moving into the right markets outside of Korea, really in terms of our global expansion. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to build partnerships because that's how we operate here. We don't try and go into markets alone. We look at optimizing relationships with players that create symbiotic benefits. And so once we see those in certain markets that we want to be in, we try and lock those down and move in. So one example of that is our partnership with the Salem Group in Indonesia. Salem Group is one of the largest conglomerates and one of the the biggest family offices. They have all the various different use cases that we're looking for in Indonesia to go into Indonesia with. And so that was very important and strategic. Another really interesting one is GMO Internet in Japan. We want to try and start bridging more of a relationship into the Japanese market because we feel that Web3 and open source blockchain can create an opportunity for the two markets to open up to each other.
Yeah, so it's all about global expansion and adoption also, which is part of your role at Klaytn. But you spoke about TPS, transaction per second, and this is based on your consensus algorithm, which is the IBFT, the Istanbul Byzantine Fault Tolerant. What's the difference between the IBFT and proof of work or proof of stake consensus?
Yeah, so it's essentially a version of proof of stake. What we've done is we've actually taken that one step further. We've made some slight mods to create what we call proof of authority, because of the model. Model for us is not anyone can come in and become a validator. So proof of stake generally, if there's a minimum amount of assets that you can stake, and you have the ability to set up the node, anyone can really come in and be a validator. That's a pure proof of stake model. For us, it's a slight mod to that where it's proof of authority, in that the barrier for you to be a validator is much higher. You need a lot of tokens. But even with a lot of tokens, if you don't have 80% quorum amongst the governance council members, of about 35 of them at the moment, then you're not going to come in. So you can pass the first barrier, but the second barrier, if you don't pass that, you don't get in. So this is where this proof of authority comes in. It's almost like when you think about, when I was at Tezos, one of the biggest issues was that having a pure public network where anyone can be a validator, you have challenges servicing, let's say, large financial institutions that are regulated, or even central banks, primarily because when you broadcast transactions, they get broadcasted throughout the whole network. And you can't control which validator picks that up. It could be one in North Korea, Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a workaround, what we used to do at Tezos is we'd white label validators and push some of those more sort of regulated transactions through that, which effectively is a hack for what we've created on a more industrial level. We have 35 large governance council members, large corporates that are quite global, and they are the only ones that will validate transactions. So there's a certain level of security and trust.
Okay, so there are 34 validators at the moment.
Yeah, 34, 35. We've made some adjustments and adding some, taking some away recently, yes.
So then within your ecosystem, there's also the KLAY token. What's the utility and how does it come? What role does it play in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so in the network, it plays the role as gas fees, obviously, very similar to ETH that way. It also acts as a utility in that it bridges, or it creates a corridor. It's a corridor asset for some of the side chains that we have built on top of Klaytn, or what we call service chains. One of them is a side chain made by a large AAA gaming studio out of Korea that's listed, called WeMade. And so it serves multiple utilities at the end of the day, though, but the core function of it is really for the purpose of gas through the network.
Gas in the network, but then also the validators, do they get any benefits, or are they staking rewards or something like that?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, there has to be an incentive for them to come on. So just like any other, layer one chain that's EVM compatible, your layer one token, your native token, you hope that there's enough demand for it relative to the supply, so that it creates some level of value, right? I mean, this is how we generate intrinsic value in these tokens, other than it being used for gas. And so with that, we have some of our governance council members who are staking their Klay assets, which will then generate a yield. And at the moment, we are remodifying or sort of rejigging our current yield pay, but we are targeting roughly about 10% on the yield for those governance council members who are staking their Klay with us.
And when we look at the token, I just noticed that you made another listing announcement now with Huobi. So congratulations on that. I saw that an hour ago, Huobi announced the listing, deposits open, trading starting soon. So this is like additional exchanges are listing Klay, and that's like part of your global adoption, I assume. What else is coming?
There's a lot. A lot of it I can't share. what I'll tell you is just more broadly speaking, so there are some large listings coming. We've been sort of looking at the right timetable, if you will, to put those through. But more importantly, there's some large partnerships coming, which are going to be really, really, I think the market will really like them. One comment I would make off the back of all of this as a footnote is with the recent issues that Luna and Terra have been seeing, Klaytn has really become the main layer 1 blockchain out of Asia. Okay, there really is no other main layer 1 that is in Asia. And that becomes quite interesting because when you tie that back or pair that back to the fact that our home ground is in Korea, China is not in business anymore, this is where everyone wants to come, it really gives us a strong positioning in Asia. And for us, what I'd like to tell your viewers and those listening is that our focus is really around trying to convert Web 2 developers and users into Web 3. Because, this, in my mind, with the current event of what's happened with Luna and Terra, this is more and more important today than it's ever been for our industry. For all of us who care about crypto and we really like crypto, decentralization and having that libertarian view is amazing. That's what got me here 10 years ago. But just like everything else in life, things have to evolve in order for it to grow and survive. And at this stage, I think there's an inflection point. The inflection point is if mass adoption is something that the industry wants, Web 2 is waiting at the doorstep and they're knocking at our door. And we strongly feel that Klaytn is the right player to be able to support that transition for a lot of the Web 2s. And so these partnerships that I was alluding to, they're coming through thick and heavy, and we'll be announcing them shortly, but I think the market will be pretty happy with them.
You also recently launched or announced the Klaytn 2022 technology roadmap. And so this had been published 3 days ago. What are the key highlights on your 2022 tech roadmap?
I kind of alluded to some of it. I think the scalability and stability in the network is very important. Creating what we call, gaming developer toolkits is also very important to us because, as I mentioned, GameFi is very important. We want to try and drive more adoption in that space and bring more developers in, particularly Web 2 guys who don't want to come through and have too much brain damage building games on Web 3. We want to be able to have enough, let's say, developer toolkits for them to be able to come on and do this pretty seamlessly. So our engineering team is really focused in on building those toolkits, as well as all the different APIs that are required to make life a bit easier. The other area is really about these, as I mentioned, third-party vendor services that are critical in order for us to achieve some of our goals. So I'll give you a very specific example. We're, in the creator market space, we're very much looking at how do we evolve from PFP or static NFTs, like what is the next step and how do we invest and how do we set up our network to prepare for that? We strongly believe that dynamic NFTs or functional NFTs within persistent metaverse environments or game environments are really key. And we think that's the next future for NFT evolution. But in order to get there, we have to have certain infrastructure in place to be able to support those assets, including oracles that can support dynamic NFT. And so we work very closely with Chainlink in that regard. They're sort of the leader in sort of the oracle space of looking at dynamic NFT technology. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but scalability, I would say, is a key important thing for us, and stability in our network.
So stability, scalability, then a lot of new areas, GameFi, what you mentioned. There's a question here from Barvik. David, can you explain and talk more about sidechains, what they are, what purpose does it serve? Do you have any sidechains at Klaytn?
Yeah, we do. I mentioned one of the main ones, which is the WeMix. We made chain, sidechain. These are service chains. They're layer 2 chains that are bolted on to our Klaytn chain. If the question is, what's the purpose of them? Essentially, when you have, in this particular case, when you have large gaming AAA companies who want to kind of create their own environment, chain environment, but yet they don't want to have to go and do all the heavy lifting of building their own layer one. The option is to have a layer two, sort of like what Polygon has done with Ethereum, where they bolt on to the layer one. And so there's pros and cons to both, and not all AAA gaming companies decided to go down this path. We Made, as an example, has. So they have their own side chain on top of Klaytn. Netmarble, as another example, they're another large AAA gaming studio that's listed in Korea. They chose not to go down the path of a side chain. They're directly built on layer one Klaytn. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the needs and the requirements of that particular organization that's building. In the case of We Made, I think they just wanted to have their own sort of chain without having to really rely on Klaytn all that much in terms of their marketing, association, etc.
Okay, and then let's take another question here. It was around here. Do you have thoughts about a metaverse for kids? Lego's planning one in collaboration with Epic Games. From the 95% on KakaoTalk, you said the population penetration of KakaoTalk in South Korea is 95. How many are, I assume many are kids as well. How's the metaverse for kids? What's your view?
Well, for any of you who have kids, I'm sure at some stage they've either played with Roblox, or they will ask you if they can play with Roblox. And, you know, it's quite interesting to see my boys. I've got an 11-year-old and a 15-year-old interact with their friends in Roblox on a server. This, more than the gaming, aspect of the metaverse, I think the social interaction is what stimulates a lot of these kids in being in this type of, you know, open world environment, so to speak. What becomes more interesting is I'm starting to see my kids, as they get older, they started playing many, many years ago, but as they're getting older, I'm starting to see them getting more interested in the economic side of Roblox. Whether it's using their Robux to buy t-shirts or trade some of their skins for something else. That, again, when I look at that trend of them starting with the social interaction and transitioning as they get older into the economic transaction of the, you know, these open world virtual environments, that's when I realized there's a huge opportunity for these kids to take part not just in the social side or the game side, but eventually they'll transition really nicely into the economic side because they will be so prepared for that. Whereas for a generation like myself, we're less, I think, easily adapted to that, because we're more adapted to using PayPal to make payments for stuff, or we're more adapted to using Visa and punching the number in to get something online. And so transitioning becomes quite intriguing, and therefore I think the adoption will be pretty high very quickly for the kids.
And now, as you are, your view is very international in many ways. You do talk to all the international players, from blockchain to traditional companies. Do you see that there's a different perspective out of South Korean companies to the rest of the world? Do they adapt to blockchain in the new world faster? And what are the kind of the big barriers or questions you get?
Yeah, absolutely. The adoption of new technology is pretty fast in Korea. Again, I think it's been just historical for governments to support that, but also for the people of Korea to want it. So that transition happens pretty quickly. I mean, you look at 5G, I think Korea was one of the first countries to adopt it and build the infrastructure pretty quickly. So that's just one example of many. But I think the difference is because we are generationally so accustomed to being virtual and on the internet more specifically, and, you know, having gone through Web 2 and Web 1 and Web 2, Web 3 becomes, I think, a pretty easy transition, which is why out of 10 Koreans that you randomly pick out of the population, 3 to 4 of them are crypto holders. But more importantly, 80% of the 3 to 4 that hold crypto hold Klay.
Mm-hmm.
So the Klay penetration rate in Korea is quite high, and I think because it's the trust with Kakao, if you ask me. So that puts us in a position of strength. But in terms of how we adapt as a society in Korea with technology, my observation is the average Korean pays more attention to the details of the digital environment that gets put in front of them than the average person out in the West. So when someone is interacting in a virtual environment, let's say a metaverse, they will pick things out like, oh, that NPC that I just engaged wasn't really engaging. Okay. Whereas I
Okay.
don't think these things are necessarily noticed in, let's say, the West when they're playing video games. You know, in the East, the gamers will pick out these things a lot faster. And again, I think it's because they're more accustomed to these environments and having used to more activity in these environments.
And now, if you look at your key elements, what you are pushing, how can you adopt? How can you create global adoption of Klaytn? What's your key actions you are now taking?
Yeah, you know, if you ask my management team, they're hoping that it's, you know, the adoption is much faster. But you know, I've been in crypto for 10 years. I started out as an ASIC miner in 2012 and have really just gone through a lot of different cycles. And the one observation I've made is market by market, every user, every developer adopts blockchain very differently. And so it becomes more of a market strategy, if I'm quite frank, than a global adoption strategy, if that makes sense. And so we are currently, from a market strategy perspective, looking at taking on day one anything outside of Korea in Asia. And our focus within that region of Asia is really around Indonesia, India, as well as Vietnam and parts of China, which we are kind of being a little bit more patient with. But really, those are the key markets that we're tending to focus in on. And sorry, Japan as well. So once we get that in terms of day one, our next focus is actually going to be in Africa. We strongly feel that the opportunities in Africa are much greater for blockchain layer one than they are in Europe or in, you know, any other part at this stage. And so we want to try and position ourselves early to work with the right partners in Africa as day two requirements to try and create adoption there.
Okay, but creating adoption also means probably creating different other top tokens. Are there many tokens on top of Klaytn? How easy is it to issue any tokens? Is it similar to like is there an ERC20 standard? Yeah,
so we're Ethereum equivalent. So our version of ERC is KIP, and so for all the different standards, we have an equivalent. So very easy, as I mentioned, for Solidity developers or anyone developing on, you know, Python or Viper to come into our environment. So and again, we've purposely tried to smooth out, let's say, the development volatility curve, so to speak, so that people can transition and onboard on the development side pretty easily. Where we need to focus in on is creating toolkits for certain use cases around building games, or, you know, building the metaverse, where we feel that by having more toolkits, this will create easier opportunities. So that's kind of where we are. We think that what's more of a focus for us is really around, now that we've got a common denominator with Ethereum, how can we create more of a bridging effect? How can we create more interoperability? How can we be more multi-chain, particularly with our EVM brothers and sisters? So we're putting a lot of engineering emphasis and support around those areas.
Okay, and there I think you're also providing the bridges to different networks. What are the killer apps at the moment, the most famous dapps or use cases on Klaytn blockchain?
Wow, yeah, there's a handful of them. I mean, KlaySwap, I think, would be our biggest. I mean, that's the one that everyone seems to know. We actually have a pretty healthy DeFi ecosystem.
So what is KlaySwap? DEX?
It's a DEX. And it's got quite a bit of liquidity for, you know, the size of the market. So that would be probably the main one that most people know. If you ask me personally, we recently launched, I would call it a super app called Change. So that's change as in CHAINGE, as in chain, and then GE.
Okay.
This thing it creates atomic swaps and interoperability between a multitude of blockchains, including Klaytn, and it does it in a very cheap and seamless way. And I would really recommend people to take a look at that app. I think that's going to be pretty game changing. And then we have, you know, maybe not on the app side, but just to give some airtime on some of the NFT projects that we have. You know, we have a very large project called KLAY City, which is our version of sort of the sandbox. It's gained a lot of popularity. I think our relationship with OpenSea has been very fruitful and meaningful for a lot of these local Korean NFT projects. We have a very strategic relationship with OpenSea. Our volumes on OpenSea are punching up right upside Ethereum. And so one thing we're in discussion with OpenSea about is how we can do more together. And as an offshoot of that, we're planning an NFT conference before the end of the year in Korea with OpenSea and Klaytn. And it would be great to see, you know, players from around the world come in and attend that.
And like with these projects like Chain, KlaySwap, and then you said KLAY City, is that developed in-house, or do you engage with these teams with your development program? How are they being started?
Great question. So we've got something called the KGF, which stands for the Klaytn Growth Fund. This is where it's our grant funding program. So we have these projects that either apply for grants and they get them, or we also have an investment team that will look at potential investment opportunities with them. So for my side, you know, I'm responsible for the grant funding. Then we have a separate CIO that looks at investments, but we work closely together. A lot of these projects were grant funded, and usually the grant funding is really tied to integration requirements, marketing requirements, or even initial build and development requirements. And so we will fund those projects if they go through the committee, and the KGF committee feels like they're appropriate and in line with the strategy, they'll get funded, and then that's when they come on to Klaytn.
Okay, yeah, let's quickly have a look at it. So open KLAY City, it really looks like a thriving big community, also with like strong partners inside there. Then you mentioned KlaySwap. Let's just move over to that. So that's the decentralized exchange on Klaytn blockchain. And then I think you said change.finance, if that's correct. Is that the one?
That's the one.
Okay, beyond trading derivatives. Sounds exciting. Yeah. So, and then last but not least, also wanted to show you this one. So the blog post on my personal blog from 2014. So I think I've been multiple times to Seoul. Had a team on the ground back then with my former company, and there I have the little here in office picture from kakaotalk's office.
Yeah.
This one, you know, it's much more blurry with the mobile phones back in the day. And then also here the Cacao Friends. So
that's right.
In my collection, the little, it's called Moosey, I think. This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a little secret for your audience here. We are working on a mascot that will sort of, you know, be an offshoot or a derivative of the Cacao Friends for Klaytn. And that will be used as a part of our education programs, as a part of our content, but more importantly, also our merchandising strategy as well. So, you know, please watch out for that.
Yeah. And I think that's really this unique or unfair advantage Klaytn has, because you've seen the future on so many sides. So I think when we talk about digital collectibles, I mean, that had been like like in South Korea on so many platforms already, but not on the blockchain. And now it's gone global. And but you've been through these digital ecosystem cycles several times. So that's exciting to see now that you're really becoming the key player then in Asia. Then there's also like these impacts. Like one more question here from Bavik, who wrote, how does Kimchi premium, the premium Bitcoin price, affect South Korean crypto market? Does it have any negative impact on retail investors? Does it have impact on KLAY, on your token?
Yeah, the Kimchi premium is sort of an older thing. I don't think it's really out there as much anymore. I think all the markets have become pretty efficient in terms of price discovery. But in the past, it was there, and there was quite a bit of opportunity, but really it was quite a bit of work to get that premium in your pocket. So yeah, I mean, that definitely that's a bit of legacy there for the Korean market versus some of the other markets, but I don't believe that is much of that's not in play as much as it used to be, sadly.
Okay, so I'm just going through more of our community questions. I think also a lot of feedback here from LCX, and I do see that there are many opportunities for us also to work together, as we could bridge the European angle here to Korea, especially with the regulatory part as well as ecosystem. Our team has already started to implement some Klaytn technology, and we will update the community on that side. Just picking a last community question here before we round up. So what would you wish for the future of Klaytn?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if I had a wish list and what was on top of it, my wish list would be to create more utility value on Klaytn for our investors, users, and our developers, and really try and stay away from adding more speculative value, which is what we've been doing, I would say, the last 8 years in crypto. I think really with the events of what's happened last week with Luna and Terra, it's really important for the whole industry to rebalance and recalibrate and look at building and continuing to build, but to build with utility value in mind and moving away from speculative value. So that's if I had a wish list, that's where my wish would be, that we continue to do that, and we are doing it, but in a more accelerated manner, in a way where that utility adds value to all our users and investors.
Where can people find more information? I put down the link here for Klaytn Foundation. Where can they find some more details if they want to know more?
Yeah, that's a really good spot. We also have a very large chat community on Telegram and Discord. If you look for us on those chat avenues, you'll find our groups. But we also have social media on Twitter, Instagram. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn. So we're on all the social media channels. If you look up Klaytn Foundation, you'll see them all.
And how can they apply to, like, if they have a great product idea, how can they apply to the funding program you have, and how can they be part of your ecosystem?
Yeah, they can, if you're a part of a very interesting project and you have some keen interest in Klaytn to possibly build on, if you go to our website, you'll see some channels there. Again, the Telegram channel or the Discord channel is also a great place to ask questions, and we can put you through to the right teams to talk to. Or you can always tweet us as well. So through any channel, really, you can reach out to us.
Perfect. Then if you want to read more about Klaytn Foundation, we will also publish some of the snippets here on our Twitter, for example, at @LCX, but also I can recommend to read our insights section at lcx.com, or just register at LCX to get started with our platform. So David, thank you for joining, talking about global adoption at Klaytn Foundation. This was super exciting, and I think now we are more even more excited about what is coming there around Klay and the whole ecosystem. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect.
Take care.
This is LCX Insights Live. For more insights, please visit lcx.com/insights and follow us on Twitter @LCX. Onwards and upwards.